Hi everyone, and welcome to our final module of the semester, which is on ethnography and oral history. Let's start with the concept of ethnography, which is the science of describing a culture. Culture can be defined as a group's observable patterns of behavior, customs, and way of life, as well as ideas, beliefs, and knowledge. Therefore, culture involves both material and cognitive elements. Now, we're less interested in anthropological theories of culture as much as the general thought patterns of anthropologists. For example, anthropologists approach their work through an emic rather than etic perspective. That is to say, when studying another culture, they try to see the world through the eyes of that culture. So instead of imposing their own outside view of things, which is called an etic perspective, the emic approach tries to see things from the inside out. This perspective involves a tension between what we might call participant and analytic perspectives. Ethnographers are simultaneously concerned with making the strange customs of others seem familiar, relatable, and understandable, as well as making otherwise familiar customs seem strange, thereby refusing to take at face value what appears to be obvious, suspending those background assumptions that immediately give apparent sense to what we experience. Ethnographers are also usually suspicious about rapid moves from statements about particular situations to broader claims, whether in the form of generalizations about some large population or inferences to some general theory. At the same time, while they usually study only a few cases, and generally speaking, cases that are themselves relatively small in scale, they are also almost inevitably concerned with drawing general conclusions of some kind. What is distinctive to their orientation is that they want to do this in ways that still respect the particularity of the cases they investigate. Finally, ethnographers tend to emphasize the processual and complex character of human social life, while at the same time seeking to generate theoretical ideas that, of necessity, involve fixing the phenomena under study as having stable characteristics that indicate membership of general categories. Stress on the importance of studying social life as a process arose to a large extent from opposition to attempts to understand it in terms of fixed, determinate relationships among variables. By contrast, ethnographers tend to emphasize the contingent and complex character of human social life, the extent to which it does not take the form of repeated patterns or standard forms. There's an important sense in which ethnography is not just a set of methods, but rather a particular mode of looking, listening, and thinking about social phenomena. In short, it displays a distinctive analytic sensibility, a set of dispositions, including the following: not jumping to quick conclusions, even though the aim is eventually to reach some sort of conclusion; paying detailed attention to appearances while not taking them at face value; seeking to understand other people's views without treating what they say as either obviously true or false; and examining the circumstances in which people act, including much that they may not be aware of themselves, yet without losing sight of what they attend to. Moving on, the bread and butter methodology of anthropologists is ethnographic fieldwork, although all sorts of disciplines can undertake fieldwork, which basically involves collecting data beyond the quote-unquote ivory tower. That is to say, outside of the controlled settings of a laboratory, library, or workplace. Ethnographic fieldwork usually involves participant observation, or living with others on a day-to-day basis for an extended period of time. Most of us won't use this particular method, although if we are going out into the field to collect data, we may informally draw from the related notion of deep hanging out as a related type of analytic sensibility that involves immersing ourselves in another culture or social context. Apart from that, a far more typical type of fieldwork that you may all be inclined to pursue is in the form of conversations and interviews, which I'll talk about more in a moment. In any case, reflexivity is an important ethical principle of fieldwork. We alluded to this in week 3 when we discussed the feminist research ethic. Essentially, reflexivity involves being aware of one's prior assumptions and beliefs, i.e., all of the preconceived baggage that we're bringing to the research table. This is always a highly relevant principle, whether in the field or not. But as far as fieldwork is concerned, reflexivity takes on another meaning, insofar as it requires the researcher to also be self-aware of their own presence in the field. Participatory observation thus involves the inclusion of the observer in the subject matter itself. We're not free-floating scientists who come from this position out of nowhere. Rather, our research in the field is situated in specific social settings and reflects our interactive encounters with informants or subjects. As such, when out in the field, we must be aware of the extent to which our own presence affects that which we are studying. A crucial tool of fieldwork is the practice of writing down field notes, although this is another method that isn't necessarily exclusive to fieldwork. However, if you are doing work out in the field, there are two types of field notes. First are the in-depth descriptive details that are written on the spot. Much like a reporter or a police officer writes down a report on the scene, this writing is not expansive, not interpretive, just a documentation of the facts in the most efficient manner possible. Just scribble or jot down short words, phrases, or questions that can jog your memory later on. Particularly when you get back later on at the end of the day in the field, when you write down so-called cooked notes, where you read thoroughly your jottings and scribblings, and then elaborate and add details and reflections in order to create something more sumptuous out of them. This is where you can be more analytical and more attentive to word choice. The idea is that you can produce content for a rough draft down the road. In some ways, field notes are very similar to journal entries or diary notes in that they are subjective representations. Ultimately, field notes are written for an audience of one, so you can use this method to work out stressful situations and feelings that may arise over the course of your research. Okay, let's move on to interviews, which is a common type of fieldwork. I'm drawing from Leanne Fuji's textbook, the opening chapter of which is one of our supplementary readings this week. She also authored one of our primary readings, which is based on her dissertation fieldwork, interviewing former perpetrators in Rwanda. So let's start with the methodological underpinnings of her relational approach to interviewing, which is based on an interpretivist rather than positivist epistemology. Interviewing is not an interrogation intended to extract information about the truth that exists out there, waiting to be mined and discovered. Rather, an interpretive methodology is intended to gain insight into participants' worlds through interaction and dialogue. That is to say, relational interviewing investigates the meanings that people give to social actions, how people interpret experience. Fuji provides a number of practical elements involved with relational interviewing. First, it requires active listening, of monitoring the communication of a message at both the content and feeling level, paying attention to what people say, how they say it, and why they're saying it. This also includes paying attention to nonverbal cues and/or silences. Relational interviewing often involves acquiring new lexicons, such as understanding foreign languages and/or new vocabularies on their own terms, as well as becoming mindful of local norms. Thirdly, this method encourages learning through missteps, acknowledging anxieties, limitations, or mistakes and failures, not as insurmountable roadblocks, but as potential moments of insight. Finally, relational interviewing involves treating people with dignity and respect, minimizing harm through meaningful protections, and engaging participants as just that, active co-participants, and not as passive subjects. However, contrary to a widespread assumption about interviewing as a methodology, Leanne Fuji argues that interviewers should focus on building relationships with their interviewees, rather than building rapport. An interviewee may not like, respect, or even welcome the prying attention of a researcher, and the researcher, in turn, may not like the interviewee, but this does not prevent the two from developing some way to work together. Instead, as a means to building a working relationship, the interviewee must become aware of differences in power, social status, and privilege between the researcher and the interviewee. What enables researchers to develop such awareness is reflexivity, a keen awareness of and theorizing about the role of the self in all phases of the research process. The reasons for such awareness are twofold. First, issues of positionality relate to the ethical dimensions of the researcher's practices and strategies. Second, issues of power and privilege bear directly on the knowledge claims that the researcher can advance. Now let's talk about the mechanics of interviewing. In basic terms, interview styles range from formal to informal, or from structured to unstructured. Structured interviews involve administering relatively standardized interview questions to all participants in a research study. This structure ensures that all persons are given equal opportunities to provide data across the same research constructs. The semi-structured interview is a qualitative data collection strategy in which the researcher asks informants a series of predetermined but open-ended questions. The researcher has more control over the topics of the interview than in unstructured interviews, but in contrast to structured interviews or questionnaires that use closed questions, there's no fixed range of responses to each question. Unstructured or open interviews involve asking relatively open-ended questions that encourage the interviewee to direct the flow of the conversation. This method can be helpful for a number of reasons, such as understanding the experience of a research subject, as it's designed for depth, not breadth. This method can also be used as a preliminary step towards structured interviews. And finally, there's informal interviewing. This type is fundamentally different from the others, because whether you're doing a structured, semi-structured, or unstructured interview, there's a shared understanding as to the purpose of the interview, as well as paperwork involved with the IRB protocol. Informal interviews are just casual, often spontaneous discussions, but you cannot, I repeat, cannot use this content for your actual research product. Really, what informal interviews are good at is kind of like what journalists call deep background, if you just want to get information or leads to follow up on later. Anyways, as you prepare for an interview, you want to develop an interview guide or plan. So you want to plan not only for the questions you want to ask, but also what order you want to ask them in and how you want to word them. For example, you may want to start with open-ended questions that are non-threatening in order to get the respondent at ease, only then moving on to more difficult questions. Avoid unintended specificity with your questions, as well as any specialized academic jargon. Use a conversational style. Over the course of the interview, if you sense that something has been left out, that the narrator could give a more complete answer, or if you're left wondering about the meaning or logic behind a prior statement, then you may need to do a bit of probing, or inviting the narrator to go into greater detail, such as by asking a follow-up question to clarify. Finally, especially given our subject matter, your interview subject may be uncomfortable with talking about certain issues. Be observant of nonverbal cues and avoid being too challenging. Be mindful as well about how you phrase your questions, and especially if the subject matter pertains to issues related to trauma, be sure to give your subjects a way out. Okay, once you've completed the interview, then what? The first thing you want to do is to transcribe the interview, as analysis is much easier in writing than orally. Take advantage of some online transcription software, such as O-Transcribe, which doesn't require you to switch between your audio and word processor apps, and enables you to pause, rewind, and fast forward without taking your hands off the keyboard. You can also use it to insert interactive timestamps to navigate through your transcript. Once you've completed the transcript, send a copy to your interviewee for any edits or clarifications, although be sure to hold on to the original copy in order to ensure that there are no substantive changes from the original. If there are, you'll need to consult your research subject to understand why. Sometimes people's perspectives on things change after talking about them. It's important to maintain intact copies of the original files, both audio and text, before you start chopping them up and copying them into your drafts. You should probably maintain a folder that includes all the originals. In terms of interpretation and analysis, there are a number of approaches to take for oral history projects. First, and most simply, you can follow a chronological life history approach for your research subject, in which you need to understand the way in which the speaker organizes the past, present, and future time during an interview. It's a simple way to start your analysis. What's their story? In many ways, this reflects the common memory that we introduced in Week 5. However, as we saw then with the alternative concept of deep memory, the impacts of trauma often interrupt the simple chronology of a life history, as oral histories related to genocide are often marked by deep scars and crevices that rupture the flow of memory. As you analyze and interpret these precipitating events, Keep in mind that episodes of deep memory reflect narrative truths, and may not always reflect historical truths. Much like the story about the woman who said she saw the 4 crematoria blow up at Auschwitz, when in fact only one did, the goal is not necessarily to explore empirical reality in a positivist sense, but to instead uncover subjective experiences in an interpretivist sense. Finally, regardless of whether or not you take such a psychoanalytical approach, you absolutely want to look for patterns and themes by grouping excerpts of your interview transcripts into categories. Okay, and that's it. We have our usual discussion forum post this week, and our research proposals are due at the end of the week. Reach out to me with any questions. Anyways, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.